Chapter 7. Captain America had taken his home country by storm, but Brant wasn't satisfied. He wanted Steve to go where the action was and energize the troops. Full of confidence and sure that he would be a star across the ocean, Steve flew over to Italy. The U.S. camp he was sent to was 5 miles from the front. When he got there, Steve took in the makeshift tents, the diverse troops, and the trucks that drove in and out at all hours carrying soldiers. It was nothing like the theaters and events back in America, where they didn't know the true horrors of war. After changing into his costume, Steve took his spot in the wings and waited for the dancing girls to do their part. Then, as he had done countless times before, he stepped through the flag and shouted, "How many of you are ready to help me sock old Adolf in the jaw?" He was met with silence. Dozens of soldiers sat in their seats, glaring at him. Their uniforms were dirty and their faces lined with fatigue. Some of them had old wounds, while others had fresh bandages on, having just returned from battle. Not one of them smiled at Steve. Looking over his shoulder, he tried to find a way out, but there was no one waiting to signal him off the stage. So he forged on. "Okay," he said hesitantly. "I'm going to need a volunteer." "I already volunteered," one of the soldiers shouted, his voice angry. "How do you think I got here?" Steve opened his mouth to respond when another soldier shouted, "Bring back the girls!" The crowd began to boo and jeer. Steve was taken aback. He had never experienced anything like this before. As Steve retreated from the stage, the boos increased. Then tomatoes started flying. Holding up his shield, Steve blocked them. But it was a foolhardy effort. Even if none of the tomatoes hit him, he still felt like the biggest buffoon this side of the Atlantic. A short while later, Steve sat in the empty bleachers, his head cradled in his hands. The soldiers had left, probably to go find real entertainment or talk about the real war and laugh at the man in the silly costume. Shame washed over Steve in huge waves. What had he been thinking? All this time he had fooled himself into believing he was a hero, a man of the people. But he was nothing but a joke. The men in the audience today were the real heroes. They had put their lives on the line time and time again, while all Steve had done was cheat his way to being a star. He hadn't even done anything with his superpowers since he had chased Kruger after the explosion. Had Erskine been wrong to think he was worthy? Had Phillips been right to doubt him? The click of heels on the ground made Steve look up. He stifled a groan. Peggy Carter was walking toward him. He hadn't seen her since he had gone out on his tour of duty, and he really didn't feel like seeing her now. She probably thought he was a joke too, and he didn't want to see the disappointment in her beautiful eyes. "What are you doing here?" he asked. "Officially, I'm not here at all," she replied. She took a seat next to him, and he met her gaze. He was surprised to see compassion there instead of disappointment, and his heart jumped in his chest. "That was quite a performance," she said, her voice gentle. Steve shrugged. "The crowds I'm used to are usually more, I understand you're America's New Hope," she said, quoting one of the many newspaper headlines about Captain America. "Senator Brant's idea," Steve said. "At least he's got me doing this. Phillips would have had me stuck in a lab." Then he sighed. He shouldn't take out his frustration on Peggy. "And these are your only 2 options? A lab rat or a dancing monkey?" "You know," he went on, "all I dreamed about was coming overseas, being with the men on the lines, seeing you. And I finally get everything I wanted. And I'm wearing tights." For a moment, Peggy didn't say anything. She wouldn't admit it out loud, but Steve's words had made her heart beat faster. He had wanted to see her? Did that mean what she thought it meant? Shaking her head, she smiled at Steve. "I thought you looked dashing, but I rather did have a thing for Errol Flynn in Robin Hood," she said with a gleam in her eyes. "The worst part is," Steve said, so lost in his own misery that he missed Peggy's obvious flirtation, I was starting to buy it.
None of us thought it would turn out like this, Peggy said. But you've done well.
Steve knew that Peggy was only trying to help. Still, he was tired of thinking about Captain America, because every time he did, a fresh wave of humiliation rolled over him. Changing the subject, he asked, "What about you?" He had been kept vaguely informed of what Peggy and Phillips had been doing since Kruger attacked the lab. He knew that they'd been chasing Hydra, but he also knew that they had had little luck. From the look on Peggy's face, he knew the reports were right.
We got word that Schmidt was moving a force through Arzano, testing some kind of new weaponry, she said after hesitating. 200 men went in, she went on. Fewer than 50 came back. Your adoring crowd tonight contained all that's left of the 107th.
Steve sat bolt upright. 107th? He repeated. Peggy nodded.
Yes, why?
He didn't bother to explain. Pulling her up, Steve began hurrying her down the bleachers, heading toward the tents. He had to see Colonel Phillips. Now. The 107th had been his father's unit in the Great War. It was the unit he'd always wanted to get into, before he'd gotten sidetracked into this super soldier business. But there was a more pressing reason for Steve's reaction to finding out that he was with the 107th now. The 107th was Bucky's unit, and he hadn't been in the audience. Steve felt panic grip him. Had Bucky been captured? Or worse? A few minutes later, Steve burst inside Phillips's tent. The colonel had arrived with Peggy after their last unsuccessful attempt to find Hydra. Now he had the miserable task of going through the paperwork to see who had survived the Arzano attack. There were a lot of names to go through. When Steve entered the tent, Phillips's eyes narrowed. He took in Steve's ridiculous costume and wondered, not for the first time, what Brandt had been thinking. "Well, if it isn't the Star-Spangled Man with the plan," he said. "I need the casualty list from Arzano," Steve demanded. Phillips raised an eyebrow. Then he pointed at the insignia on his collar stating his rank. "You don't get to give me orders, son," he said. Was this kid for real? Did he think that even with a fake title like Captain, he could order him around? But Steve wasn't going to be dissuaded. "I don't need the whole list," he went on. "Just one name, Sergeant James Barnes from the 107th. "You and I are going to have a conversation later that you won't enjoy," Phillips said. "Please tell me he's alive, sir. B-A-R, I can spell," the colonel said. "I've signed more of these condolence letters today than I would care to count." He began to leaf through the giant pile of papers in front of him. Each paper had the name, title, and contact information of a man who had been killed in the line of duty. "The name does sound familiar," he finally said. He couldn't find the paper now, but he was sure that Barnes was one of the casualties. "I'm sorry." Steve paled. Bucky had died fighting while Steve had been playing a clown. It wasn't fair. Turning, Steve's eyes fell on one of the maps that Phillips had tacked to the wall. It showed aerial footage of a Hydra facility. Given that the SSR had just lost men in the same vicinity, Steve figured this was where the prisoners of war were being held. "What about the others?" he asked, turning back to the colonel. "You're planning a rescue mission, right?" The colonel started in his seat, as though about to stand up and hit Steve for insubordination. But a glance from Peggy stopped him. Instead, he just said, "Yeah, it's called winning the war." The men from the 107th were a lost cause. Sending in a team to try to rescue them would only result in more casualties that the Army couldn't afford. "But if you know where they are," Steve started to say, but Phillips stopped him. "They're 30 miles behind the lines," he said. "Through some of the most heavily fortified territory in Europe. We'd lose more men than we'd save. Now, if I read the posters correctly, you've got some place to be in 30 minutes. Phillips meant the next show, but when Steve said, "Yes, sir, I do," he meant something else. Then, with a nod, Phillips dismissed Steve. Turning, Steve left the tent. Phillips may not have had any intention of rescuing those men, but Steve wasn't going to sit by and do nothing. Not anymore. He'd figure out a way to get to that facility. He had to. He owed it to Bucky.
"What do you plan to do? Walk to Austria?"
Peggy asked. "If that's what it takes."
"You heard the Colonel. Your friend is most likely dead."
Steve would not accept this. He turned to Peggy. "You told me you thought I was meant for more than this. Did you mean that?"
"Every word,"
she said. "Then you gotta let me go," he said. Peggy thought about it. "Come on," Steve thought. "You know I'm wasted here. You know I can do some good. Let me prove it. Please, let me prove it."
"I can do more than that,"
she said. Steve grabbed one of the dancing girls' USA helmets, the one with the A on it, and dashed off. It was time for action. Captain America was about to go behind enemy lines to rescue captured American soldiers. Steve Rogers was finally going to war. Chapter 8. And so later that night, Steve found himself inside the belly of a giant silver jet. On the bench across from him, Peggy Carter sat going over details of his seemingly impossible mission. In the cockpit, Howard Stark checked dials and instrument readings as he flew the plane farther and farther into enemy territory. He was the only pilot Peggy could find who was crazy enough to fly into enemy territory, and who didn't have to answer to Colonel Phillips. "The Hydra camp is in Crossburg," Stark was shouting over the sound of the engines. "It's up between these two mountain ranges. We should be able to drop you around the doorstep." "Just get me as close as you can," Steve said. He would handle the rest of it himself. Only Peggy and Stark knew what Steve was up to, and Steve shuddered at the thought of Phillips finding out. If discovered, he would surely be court-martialed and discharged from the army. But Steve wasn't about to just keep sitting around. He had seen the map. He had super strength. And if he failed, Phillips would probably be happy to have Captain America out of his hair. Steve just wished Peggy hadn't put herself on the line for him. "You know you two are going to be in a lot of trouble when you land," he said quietly, his voice just loud enough to carry above the whine of the engines.
"And you won't?"
Peggy answered. "Where I'm going, if anybody yells at me, I can just shoot them."
"And they will undoubtedly shoot back."
Peggy didn't say it, but Steve was worth the risk. After all, she'd seen him try harder than anyone else back at Camp Lehigh, even when the odds were stacked against him. And now his best friend was presumed dead, and others had been captured. Of course Peggy would help. Plus, this would be the first real test of Dr. Erskine's super soldier program. She had waited a long time for it. Turning around in his seat, Stark smiled his charming smile. Unlike Steve and Peggy, he didn't seem bothered by the late-night stealth mission. In fact, he looked more confident and charming than usual. "Well, let's hope this is good for something, Agent Carter," he said, focusing his handsome grin on Peggy. "If you're not in too much of a hurry, I thought we could stop off in Lucerne for late-night fondue." Heat rushed to Peggy's cheeks as Steve raised an eyebrow. She grinned at the obvious jealousy on his face.
"Stark's the best civilian pilot I've ever seen," she said in response to Steve's reaction. "And mad enough to brave this airspace. We're lucky to have him."
"So you too?" Steve hesitated, causing Peggy to grin even more. "Do you... fondue?" He was cut off by the sudden sound of gunfire. The plane lurched to the left as more guns hammered at its side. They were close to the drop zone, and Hydra didn't want them there.
"This is your transponder,"
Peggy said, handing him the small device.
"Activate it when you're ready, and the signal will lead us straight to you."
Steve eyed it skeptically. "Are you sure this thing works?" "It tested more than you, pal," Stark said from the cockpit. Pulling on his parachute, Steve opened the jump door. The plane tilted left and then right as Stark executed evasive maneuvers. Still, the side of the plane was getting pummeled with bullets. Steve had to get out of there now before they all went down. "Once I'm clear, turn this thing around," he said, looking at Peggy. "And get out of here."
"You can't give me orders,"
Peggy shouted over the howling wind. Steve just smiled. "Yes, I can. I'm a captain." And then, before she could say anything else, Steve jumped, disappearing from view. The air rushed by, whipping Steve's hair and pulling at his clothes. Somewhere above him, he was vaguely aware that Stark had turned the plane around and was heading toward safer airspace. The guns went quiet, and Steve breathed a sigh of relief. Peggy and Stark would be okay. He had a set count based on the plane's altitude when he jumped. 3, 2, 1. He reached it and pulled the ripcord. When the chute deployed, it slowed him so much that it felt like he was being pulled up, even though in reality he was just slowing down. When he felt steady, Steve looked down, trying to see if he could spot a clear landing place. But the only thing he could see was the flash of gunfire as bullets flew through the air. The parachute had 2 steering ropes with wooden handles. They didn't help much, but they were all he had. He hauled on them, trying to angle the chute away from the enemy fire. But it was no use. Bullets ripped through the chute, and Steve began falling faster and faster. Luckily, he had made it pretty close to the ground before the shooting started, and now the forest was only about 20 feet below. Unhooking himself, Steve used his shield to brace for impact as he plummeted to the ground. Crashing through the trees as they ripped at his clothes and scratched his face, Steve landed with a thud. The gunfire stopped. The enemy must have assumed the fall had killed him. If he hadn't had Erskine's serum, they would have been right. But as things stood, Captain America was alive and behind enemy lines, mere miles from the Hydra base. It was time to go save some soldiers. Moments later, Steve found himself outside the main gates to the Hydra factory. It was just where Peggy had said it would be. It was also just as heavily guarded as she had warned. Searchlights swept from several watchtowers along the perimeter, while thick barbed wire sat atop the wall surrounding the compound. Steve could make out the main factory building, which was billowing smoke while heavily armed Hydra troopers marched back and forth across the grounds. Steve needed a plan. Clearly he wasn't going to be able to just waltz right in there and ask for the prisoners back. The dark was suddenly illuminated by headlights as a convoy of 3 trucks pulled up to the gate. This was his break. As the driver of the first truck stopped to clear his entrance with the guard, Steve snuck over to the last vehicle and, making sure no one saw him, jumped inside. All he had to do was KO a couple of guards inside and hide underneath a tarp. Piece of cake. A moment later, the truck started up again and drove through the gate. Steve was in. When he was sure that the coast was clear, Steve got out and slipped into the shadows. Now that he was inside the compound, he could make out more buildings and even more troopers. His eyes grew wide when he saw 2 Hydra goons leading a long line of prisoners across the compound. Steve followed them to one of the barracks. As one of the guards brought the prisoners inside, the others stood at the door on watch. With one swift move, Steve took him out using a powerful roundhouse kick. Then he silently slipped into the prison. As soon as his eyes adjusted to the dark, Steve's mouth dropped open in terror. The barracks were something out of a nightmare. Dozens of circular cages filled the space, and each one overflowed with prisoners. There had to be hundreds of them. That meant Hydra had captured more than just the 107th, Steve realized. He'd have to let Phillips know. But first, he needed to get them out. There was a raised platform above the cages, and a guard was pacing back and forth on it. Quietly, Steve made his way up and then, crack! With a swift punch, he knocked out the guard, who then dropped off the platform and onto the cages below. The prisoners looked up, confused. One of the men, a soldier by the name of Jones, watched as Steve stepped out of the shadows. He took in his helmet and shield. "Who are you supposed to be?" he asked. "I'm Captain America," Steve answered, ignoring the groans that went up from the cages. He knew they had a right to doubt him, but he'd prove them wrong. He grabbed the key off the unconscious guard and raced down the line of cages, opening each one. Hordes of men spilled out, shaking their numb limbs and stretching their sore muscles. "Are there any others?" Steve asked when everyone was out. "The isolation ward," an Allied soldier named Dum Dum Dugan answered. "On the factory floor." Steve nodded. That was where he would go next. Leaving the others to find weapons and a way to distract the remaining guards, Steve made his way to the factory. The Hydra troopers hadn't noticed that they were under attack. Yet. But they would soon, and Steve still had men to rescue. Staying in the shadows, he ducked past trooper after trooper until he finally made it to the front door. Using his red, white, and blue shield as an offensive weapon, he smashed 2 Hydra guards in the face, knocking them out so he could make his way inside. The factory floor was covered in weapons of war. There were hundreds of crates full of complete bombs and other crates with what looked like unfinished bombs. Inside even more crates, clusters of cartridges lay nestled in straw. Stepping closer, Steve noticed that the bombs and cartridges emitted a strange blue glow, just like the super soldier serum. Pocketing one cartridge, he reminded himself to brief Phillips on this when, or rather, if, he got back to the base. Steve then cautiously continued through the bomb-making factory, heading toward the offices at the other end of the hangar. But unbeknownst to Steve, the factory wasn't just another Hydra base. It was also Johann Schmidt's current headquarters, and he was watching everything Steve did over a closed-circuit camera. The Hydra leader heard a loud explosion outside and turned to look at another monitor that revealed 4 prisoners blasting a hole in the factory wall. As the alarm blared and guards rushed out, Schmidt turned his attention back to the image of Steve. He watched as he punched and kicked his way past dozens of guards, getting closer and closer to Schmidt's office. It was an impressive, if annoying, sight. "Doctor," Schmidt said, turning to his lead scientist, Arnim Zola. "Prepare to evacuate." Zola, the finest mind in Hydra, with the exception of Schmidt himself, of course, nervously eyed the camera, shifting between the action outside and the action inside the factory walls. "I'm sure our forces can handle," he began. "Our forces are outmatched," Schmidt snarled. "By one man," he added quietly. Looking down at the equipment panel in front of him, Schmidt flipped a switch and a countdown clock lit up. Then he slipped out the door and down the long corridor. Steve had just made it into the corridor when he saw the scientist retreat and heard the door to the lab close. He didn't know who the man was, but by the way he kept glancing back at the door, Steve figured something important was in there. When the other man was out of sight, Steve slipped inside and shut the door behind him. The lab was full of files and paperwork. Specimen jars lined shelves and various monitors beeped. In the middle of the room, a large cage sat atop a rusty drain. And inside the cage, Steve saw the back of a man who was slumped on the ground. Hearing footsteps, the man spoke up, his voice scratchy.
"Barnes, James Buchanan, Sergeant," he said.
Steve paused in mid-step. It couldn't be. "Bucky?" he said softly. Steve raced over and crouched down in front of the cage. Bucky was inside. He was beaten and grizzled, but he was alive. With one mighty swing, Steve smashed the lock. Then he held out his hand. "It's me, Buck."
"Steve?"
Bucky said, taking in his old friend's new look. "I thought you were dead," Steve said.
"I thought you were smaller,"
Bucky replied, as Steve hauled him to his feet and helped him out of the cage. When they were both standing, Bucky stared up at his friend, his eyes disbelieving. This wasn't the Steve he knew. This Steve was bigger, faster, and stronger than the scrawny kid Bucky grew up with in Brooklyn. And now, in a startling turn of events, Steve was about to save Bucky.
"What happened to you?"
Bucky finally asked. "I joined the army," Steve answered, matter-of-factly. Suddenly, a blast rocked the room. One of the machines on the factory floor was triggered to explode, and it sent Steve and Bucky hurtling. They would have to catch up later. Right now, they had to get out of there. Putting an arm around Bucky, Steve began to lead him from the room. Out of the corner of his eye, Steve spotted a map on one of the walls. He paused, noticing that it was covered in Hydra symbols that spread all across Europe. He took a mental picture of the map, and then, as another explosion rocked the building, moved back into the hall with Bucky. All around them, bombs continued to go off, shaking the foundation of the factory and making it hard to move quickly. As they made their way down the corridor, Bucky continued trying to get answers. He figured Steve must have undergone some kind of treatment or been in an experiment. There was no way he could have naturally changed into the man who stood next to him. "Did it hurt?" he asked. "A little bit," Steve answered, dodging a piece of ceiling as it crashed to the ground. "Is it permanent?" "So far," Steve said. They had reached a stairwell that led either up to a catwalk or down, back toward the factory floor. Steve started to lead them down when another series of explosions ripped through the building. A huge chunk of wall fell onto the stairs, blocking their way. It looked as if they were going to have to head up. Dragging the still weak Bucky, Steve got them up onto the catwalk. Outside, he heard shouts as the escaping prisoners fought against the Hydra soldiers. More bombs went off, making Steve's ears ring. When the smoke cleared, he noticed that someone was blocking their way. "Captain America! How exciting!" Johann Schmidt said, a sneer on his face. In his hand he held what looked like a titanium box. "I am a great fan of your films," he went on. He handed the box to the man in the lab coat Steve had seen earlier. Then Schmidt moved forward. Steve took a step forward as well. "So, Dr. Erskine managed it after all," Schmidt continued. "Not exactly an improvement, but still, impressive." Anger filled Steve as Schmidt spoke. With a cry of rage, he pulled back his arm and punched Schmidt as hard as he could. The Hydra leader went stumbling backward. "You've got no idea," Steve said. A smile played over Schmidt's face, and he looked almost pleased by Steve's reaction. "Haven't I?" he asked. Then he swung. Thinking quickly, Steve threw up his mighty shield, blocking the punch. When he lowered the shield, there was a fist-sized dent in it. Steve looked up, confused. A moment later, Schmidt hit him, knocking him to the ground. "Erskine said your experiment was a failure," Steve said, trying to catch his breath. He kicked his legs, driving his feet hard into Schmidt's jaw. Seeing his leader on the ground, the Hydra scientist raced over to the catwalk controls. His name popped into Steve's head from an intelligence file. Arnim Zola. Zola flipped a switch, and the catwalk split in two, each side retracting into the walls. Steve and Schmidt were separated from each other as both men got to their feet. When Steve looked over at the Hydra leader, his jaw dropped. It looked like Schmidt's face was on crooked. Red muscles seemed to bulge out of torn seams in Schmidt's head, as if his sinister self could no longer be contained by human skin. "A failure?" Schmidt said. "Oh, no, Captain. I was his greatest success." Then, with an evil grin, Schmidt reached up and pulled off his face. It had only been a mask, and underneath was a gruesome bony skull with blood-red skin stretched tightly over it. Schmidt's eyes blazed under the heavy ridges of his eyebrows. As Steve and Bucky gaped at the horrific sight, Schmidt let out a diabolical laugh. Then, turning, he slipped into the nearby elevator, where Arnim Zola waited. A moment later, the doors slammed shut. Schmidt had escaped, but Steve and Bucky were trapped. Another series of explosions rocked the building, and the catwalk shuddered beneath Steve and Bucky. There was no time to worry about the Hydra leader now. They had to get out of there, or they were going to end up falling to their deaths. Before Bucky could protest, Steve picked him up and threw him across the gap between the two sides of the catwalk. He was about to follow him when, boom, boom, boom. More explosions caused the catwalk to split even wider. Steve was left stranded on one side, while Bucky waited for him on the other. "Just get out!" Steve shouted to his friend. "Not without you!" Bucky shouted back as the roof began to collapse. Steve looked around. The only way out was on the other side of the catwalk. He raced back as far as he could to give himself a running start, and then took off. He was going to jump. He ran faster and faster. When he reached the edge, he gave himself one last push and leaped, just as the biggest bomb went off. Bucky watched in horror as Steve disappeared into the flames. Chapter 9. Colonel Phillips sat in front of his typewriter, his fingers hesitating over the keys. Taking a deep breath, he continued his note. Senator Brandt, regret to report Captain Stephen Rogers, KIA. He stopped typing as Peggy Carter came to the door. She looked tired and sad. In her hand, she held aerial photographs of the destroyed Hydra camp. No sign of activity, she reported. Phillips stared at her, his expression cold. She had disobeyed direct orders and helped Steve on his ill-fated mission. While Phillips had never really liked Steve, he didn't think the kid should have been put in a situation like that. He wasn't equipped to handle it, even if he had a captain before his name. We can't touch Stark, Phillips said after a tense moment of silence. He's rich, and he's the Army's #1 weapons contractor. You are neither. Peggy nodded. She had expected that reaction, and frankly, she didn't care. Not anymore. Not with Steve dead. You'll have my resignation in the morning, she said. She paused, as if not sure whether to go on. With respect, sir, I don't regret my actions, and I doubt Captain Rogers did either. What makes you think I give a damn about your opinions? I took a chance on you, Agent Carter, Phillips said, untouched by her words. Now America's golden boy and a lot of other men are dead because you had a crush. It wasn't that, she said. It was faith. But Colonel Phillips didn't hear her because of a rising commotion outside. Soldiers were running by, shouting to one another excitedly. Walking to the window, Peggy and Phillips looked out. The gates to the camp were opening, and beyond them, battered and bruised but very much alive, was Captain America. Steve and Bucky walked slowly up the road, leading the squad of rescued soldiers back to their Italian home. A ragtag group of vehicles followed farther behind, carrying the wounded and weak. Once inside the base, Steve pushed through the growing crowd and made his way over to Phillips and Peggy. Colonel, he said, his tone weary. Some of these men need medical attention. Phillips nodded and Steve went on. I'd like to surrender myself for disciplinary action. The colonel looked at Steve, then at the soldiers stumbling into the camp, and then back at Steve. Despite the bruises and scratches all over his body, Steve's eyes were alert. The events at the factory had changed him. He wasn't the same man who had gone beyond enemy lines. He had faced real danger and survived. That won't be necessary, Phillips finally said. Yes, sir, Steve said. Phillips turned to Peggy. Faith, huh? Then he walked away, leaving Steve open-mouthed with shock. He had finally proven himself to the toughest man he knew. Turning, his eyes met Peggy's. There was a jolt of electricity, and Steve felt his heart begin to race. There was so much he wanted to say to her, but she beat him to it. You're late, she stated. He smiled. That was probably the closest he was going to get to a welcome home from Peggy. But he'd take it. Couldn't call my ride, he said, teasing her. Before he could say more, soldiers crowded around him, clapping him on the back and congratulating him. Peggy stayed right with him. Steve couldn't keep the smile from his face. For the first time since he'd donned the Captain America costume, he truly felt like a hero. And it felt good. A few days later, Steve attended a briefing at the London headquarters of the SSR. A newspaper lay on one of the tables. Its headline read, Captain America to receive Medal of Valor. However, Steve had no interest in attending the ceremony. Medals didn't matter to him. What mattered was winning the war. As Peggy and Stark looked on, Steve sketched out the locations of the Hydra bases he had seen back in Schmidt's office. One here in Poland, one on the Baltic, and the sixth one was about 40 miles west of the Maginot Line, he said, adding the last 3. Then, looking over at Peggy and Stark, he added, I just got a quick look. Peggy smiled. Since he had returned from the Hydra camp, things had changed between them. They both felt a spark lying just below the surface, ready to ignite. Nobody's perfect, she said, her eyes twinkling. Just then, Colonel Phillips entered. Walking over, he glanced at the map on the table and then at the blue cartridge Steve had taken from the Hydra factory. You figure out what this is yet? Phillips asked. Howard Stark had suffered through Steve and Peggy's flirting for far too long. Eager for a diversion, he answered, The most powerful explosive known to man, according to Rogers. There was a hint of bitterness in Stark's voice. He prided himself on inventing the most powerful things. He didn't like it that he'd been beaten to the punch. Taking out a pair of tweezers, he gingerly picked up the cartridge. Either Schmidt's darn near rewritten the laws of physics, he went on, or this isn't from... He couldn't say it out loud. It seemed impossible that Schmidt's delusional belief in gods and other worlds could have any basis in fact. He shook his head. I can say that if they've got enough of it, this war isn't going the way anyone thinks it is. The room fell silent as Stark's words sank in. They were at a critical point in the war. If this cartridge was just one of many, then the results would be worldwide annihilation and Hydra domination. Walking over to the map, Phillips began tracing the various X's that marked the Hydra camps. Then we'd better take it away from them, he finally said. These are the weapons factories we're talking about? Steve put down his pencil and shook his head. Not all of them, he answered. Sergeant Barnes, said Hydra shipped all the parts to another facility that isn't on this map. Bucky overheard a lot while he'd been kept in the cage in Hydra's science lab. He filled Steve in on as much as he could remember during the trek back from the factory. This piece of information was the most important of all. The room fell silent again as they all processed the news that there were more bombs out there. Bombs of otherworldly power. They needed to get their hands on them before Schmidt had the chance to use them. And while they didn't know where the majority of the bombs were being shipped, thanks to Steve's map, they did know where the other Hydra bases were. Maybe destroying them would put Schmidt on edge and give SSR the advantage. Agent Carter, Colonel Phillips said, coordinate with MI6. I want every Allied eyeball looking for that main Hydra base. What about us? We are going to light a fire under Johann Schmidt's ass, Colonel Phillips said. Turning to face Steve, he smiled. What do you say, Rogers? It's your map. Think you can wipe Hydra off of it? Steve returned the smile. There was nothing he would like to do more, and he had the perfect team in mind to help him. The Whip and Fiddle was a local London pub that served cold drinks, warm food, and good cheer. That night, it was full of the soldiers Steve had helped rescue from the Hydra factory. Making his way through the crowd, Steve found Bucky in the back, leaning against a bar stool. 5 other men, Falsworth, Jones, Dernier, Morita, and Dugan, stood a bit to the side. Since rescuing them, these men had become Steve's friends, and he hoped they'd now become his teammates. Let me get this straight, Dum-Dum Dugan said after Steve explained the mission. We barely got out of there alive, and you want us to go back? Pretty much, Steve answered, nodding. Dugan shrugged. Sounds rather fun, actually, he said. The other 4 nodded in agreement, and Steve tried not to laugh. That had been easier than he expected. Now he had the rest of the night to have a good time before they set out in the morning. Turning, he joined Bucky at the bar. What about you? Steve asked when they were alone. You ready to follow Captain America into the jaws of death? To Steve's surprise, Bucky shook his head. No, he answered, and Steve's mouth dropped open. Then Bucky added, That little guy from Brooklyn, the kid in the alley who couldn't stay down and wouldn't take no for an answer? I'm following him. Steve smiled at his old friend. You're keeping the outfit, right? Bucky asked. Steve nodded. It's kind of growing on me. They were still talking about strategy and the mission when Steve looked up and saw Peggy making her way through the crowd. She had traded her usual uniform for a red dress and looked beautiful. Noticing that his friend was distracted, Bucky turned and saw Peggy. He smiled. Not bad.
"Captain?"
she said.
"Agent Carter?"
Bucky stood. "Ma'am?" Joining them, Peggy informed Steve that he had an early morning meeting with Stark. Apparently, the inventor had been working day and night to create some new equipment and needed Steve to come by and try it out. Then she noticed Falsworth and Jones were standing in the middle of the room, singing at the top of their lungs. Dernier and Morita looked on, laughing as the two men tried to pull a couple of girls in for a dance.
"I see your crack-top squad is prepping for duty,"
she observed. Bucky gave Peggy one of his trademark grins, the one that had caused plenty of Brooklyn girls to go weak at the knees. "You don't like music?" he asked playfully.
"I do, actually,"
Peggy answered, looking not at Bucky but at Steve.
"I may even, when this is all over, go dancing."
The music grew louder, but it seemed that Peggy and Steve couldn't hear it. They just continued to look at each other, as though having a silent conversation. Growing tired of it, Bucky held out a hand and said, "Then what are you waiting for?" Never looking away from Steve, Peggy said,
"The right partner."
Then she executed a turn in her stunning dress and left them there with Dugan's band of drunken maniacs. Bucky groaned. "I'm invisible!" he cried. Then a realization struck him, and he laughed. "I'm turning into you! It's a horrible dream." Steve gave him a wicked smile. "Don't take it so hard," he said teasingly. "Maybe she's got a friend." As Bucky stormed off, Steve just stood there with a smile on his face. True, he was about to go on a dangerous mission, but things suddenly felt really good. He had his best friend back, a great team to rely on, and maybe, just maybe, a future with Peggy. For the first time in a long while, things were beginning to look up. Chapter 10. The next morning, Steve reported to Stark's office as requested, but when he got there, Stark had not yet arrived. A young blonde woman sitting behind a desk informed Steve that the inventor would be there in a minute. Then she introduced herself as Private Lorraine.
"The women of America owe you their thanks,"
she said, getting up and walking over to Steve.
"And seeing as they're not here—"
Before Steve knew what was happening, Private Lorraine leaned in, and they were kissing. Just then, Peggy entered the office, and the look on her face could have turned a man to stone.
"Captain,"
she said in a voice that froze him where he stood.
"We're ready for you, if you're not otherwise occupied."
Turning, she stalked out the door. Steve followed, hot on her heels.
"Agent Carter,"
he called. "Peggy, wait a second."
"Looks like finding a partner wasn't that hard after all,"
she said. "That's not what you thought it was," Steve said.
"I don't think anything, Captain,"
she said.
"Not one thing. Always wanted to be a soldier, and now you are, just like all the rest."
It wasn't right, but he couldn't convince her. "Well, what about you and Stark?" he said. "How do I know you two haven't been fonduing?" She looked at him, still angry, but now with something like pity in her expression too.
"You still don't know a bloody thing about women,"
she said. That was when Howard Stark finally showed up. Apparently he'd overheard some of the conversation, because he said, "Fondue's just cheese and bread, my friend." "Really? I didn't think, nor should you, pal," Stark said. "The minute you think you know what's going on in a woman's head, your goose is well and truly cooked. Me, I concentrate on work, which at the moment is about making sure you and your men do not get killed." After giving Private Lorraine a grin, he led Steve down to his lab, where technicians were busy unwrapping various pieces of equipment. Others were installing futuristic machines like those Steve had seen back at the World Exhibition of Tomorrow. Peggy stood to one side, her arms crossed. Ignoring everyone else, Stark walked over to a slightly less cluttered section of the lab. Lying on a table was what looked like a bodysuit. Steve cocked his head. What on earth was it? "Steel micromesh for the sleeves," Stark explained, pointing to the suit's arms. "Titanium panels for your more vulnerable parts, chest plates and such." Steve's eyes grew wide as Stark moved down the table and picked up a gray-colored material. He was getting his very own state-of-the-art combat suit. "Carbon polymer," Stark went on. "It's flexible, insulated, fire-resistant, and ought to hold its own against your average German bayonet, although Hydra's not going to attack you with a pocket knife." And that's when Stark guided Steve over to another table and presented him with the biggest surprise of all. "I hear you're, kind of attached," he said, pointing. On the table was an array of shields in various stages of construction. Some of them had gadgets on them, one had lights, and another looked like it had been painted with camouflage. "It's handier than you might think," Steve said. "I took the liberty of coming up with some options," Stark said, and started pointing out different features of different shields. Steve's attention, however, went immediately to a plain silver one lying at the end of the table, partially covered with a tarp. It didn't have any gadgets or lights or hidden compartments. Instead, it was lightweight, balanced, and almost indestructible. It was the perfect offensive and defensive symbol of the United States of America, and it would become Captain America's most trusted and well-known weapon. Cautiously, Steve reached out and ran a hand across the shield's smooth surface. Then he gave it a tap, and it rang like a bell. "What about this one?" he asked. "No, that's just a prototype." "What's it made of?" "Vibranium," Stark informed them. 100 times stronger than steel and 1/3 the weight. Picking it up, Steve slid the shield onto his arm as Stark continued. "It's completely vibration absorbent. Should make a bullet feel like a cotton ball." Steve smiled. This was the best thing he'd ever seen, if it was true. "Then how come it's not standard issue? That's the rarest metal on Earth. What you're holding there, that's all we've got." "Are you quite finished, Mr. Stark?" Peggy asked. "I'm sure the captain has some unfinished business." Steve hefted the shield. He was already loving how light and strong it felt. He turned to Peggy and asked, "What do you think?" In answer, she picked up a gun from a nearby lab table. She leveled it at him and fired 4 times. Steve ducked behind the shield, bracing himself for the impact of the bullets. But one after another, they hit the shield and plunked harmlessly to the ground. He barely felt the impacts. "Yes, I think it works," she said. Then she stalked out of the room. Steve gulped. He had some serious explaining to do. Howard Stark tried to hide a grin. But it would have to wait. Right now, he had to go after Hydra. Lucky for him, he seemed to have an excellent new shield to make the mission a little easier. He prodded the 4 flattened slugs on the lab floor. This vibranium was pretty amazing. Steve looked over at Stark, who just shrugged. Steve hoped that Peggy would forgive him by the time he came back. Chapter 11. For the next few months, Captain America and his ragtag unit of Howling Commandos traveled all over Europe, chasing down and destroying as many Hydra bases as they could find. First, they headed to France. This was one of the weaker Hydra stations, and in no time, the team took it over. Back at their headquarters, Peggy replaced one of the X's with an SSR flag. Then they headed to Poland, where Bucky took out the guard at the front gate so the team could enter. As the others streamed past them, he and Steve traded knowing smiles. It was just like being back in Brooklyn, only slightly more dangerous. Another SSR flag was pinned on the map. Next up was a base in Czechoslovakia. Signaling for the others to wait, Captain America made his way inside by himself. Ducking and weaving past the Hydra troopers, he found the collection of bombs. He quickly placed a detonator among them and then grabbed one of the troopers' bikes, jumped on it, and raced away. He barely managed to crash through a factory window before the place exploded behind him. Another base destroyed. The rest of the team was having fun taking revenge against the organization that had held them prisoner. In Greece, Dernier set another explosive charge and, boom, the place blew to bits. Pinned down in Germany, Morita shouted coordinates to Jones over a handheld radio. Jones quickly fired his weapon while at the same time Falsworth threw a grenade. The base exploded. Another Hydra camp down. The team's wave of destruction did not go unnoticed. Johann Schmidt had taken refuge in a secret Greek camp, one of the few remaining Hydra strongholds. Standing in front of his troop leaders, Schmidt, now known to his followers as the Red Skull, raged on. "We are close to an offensive that will shake the planet," he said angrily. "Yet we are continually delayed because you can't outwit a clown dressed in a flag!" This was unacceptable. Captain America and his howling commandos needed to be taken out, fast. For the first time since the attacks began, the Red Skull's evil smile returned. He had come up with a good idea, an idea that would take care of Captain America, once and for all. Unaware of the Red Skull's plans, Cap, Bucky, and the rest of the team gathered on a plateau high above a Russian valley. The sun was not up yet, and the wind was cold as it whipped around them. Steve was nervous. There had been no base in this area marked on the map, which meant it was either a trap or a huge find. Using one of the Hydra code transceivers they'd stolen from a captured base, they had intercepted a transmission claiming that a large Hydra train was on the move through a nearby Alpine pass, and that Hydra's top scientist was on board. Steve had made the decision to act. It was risky to go into unknown territory, but this might be the chance they needed to finish off Hydra once and for all. As Jones listened to another transmission, Dugan and Falsworth kept a lookout on the valley below. Meanwhile, Cap, Bucky, and Dernier moved closer to the edge. "The train engineer just radioed ahead," Jones called out. "Hydra gave him permission to open the throttle. Wherever their base is, he's trying to make it there by dawn." He paused and then added, "With their biggest shipment yet." Just then, a train whistle blew, piercing the silence of the night. Looking through his binoculars, Dugan saw a large, futuristic-looking train racing down the tracks. Turning, he nodded at Steve. It was time. "Remember when I made you ride the Cyclone on Coney Island?" Bucky asked Steve. "Yeah, and I threw up." "This isn't payback, is it?" "Now why would I do that?" Jones called out again. "Dr. Zola is on this train. Wherever he's going, they must need him bad." "We've only got about a 10-second window," Steve said. "You missed that window? We're bugs in a windshield." Quickly, Dernier helped Cap, Bucky, and Jones strap into harnesses. Then he snapped 3 hooks onto a long cable that stretched out over the pass. This was how they were going to get on the train. But they had to time it just right. If they didn't, they'd either be crushed by the train or by the opposite wall of the valley. The train whistle blew again, and Captain America nodded at his men. "Mind the gap," Falsworth said. "Now." Together they pushed off, zipping down toward the oncoming train. For a moment, it looked as if they were going to miss. But then with a thud, they landed on the slick roof. Unhooking themselves, they let the cable fly away. They didn't want to leave any evidence of their presence. As planned, Jones headed toward the engine of the train. His mission was to somehow stop the train so the rest of the team would have enough time to get down there. Steve and Bucky, meanwhile, were going after the explosives. Jumping down into the train, the squad found themselves in the first car. It was empty. Moving into the next car, they exchanged looks. It was empty too. This didn't seem right. Cautiously, they entered the next car. Unlike the others, this car was pitch dark and eerily quiet. Steve couldn't even hear the sound of the rushing wind outside. Then, wham! Behind them, a steel plate dropped down, blocking the back door. A moment later, the lights flickered on. It was a trap. Standing in front of them was the largest Hydra trooper Steve had ever seen. The monster of a man was easily over 6.5 feet tall, and instead of arms, he had 2 huge robotic cannons attached to his shoulders. It was the perfect plan. The Red Skull had lured Captain America here so that this thing could kill him. Steve shook his head in revolt. He and his men had come too far to let that happen. Pulling out his gun, Cap opened fire, but the bullets just zinged harmlessly off the trooper's armor. Then, as Steve watched in horror, the trooper raised one of his cannon arms, aimed, and fired. Blam! A blue energy pulse sent Steve flying into the sidewall of the train, knocking the breath out of him. He recovered and used the ceiling racks to swing the length of the train car in a single motion, driving both feet into the Hydra trooper and knocking him down. Then a blow from Steve's shield kept him down. But Bucky was trapped in the other car, pinned down by another Hydra soldier. He was out of ammunition. Steve rushed to the door and caught Bucky's eye through the window. He opened the door and tossed Bucky his own pistol, then dove into the car so his shield provided cover for Bucky to return fire. Bucky put the Hydra trooper down. They looked at each other. "I had him on the ropes," Bucky said. Steve nodded. "I know you did." Then another burst of blue energy seared through the car, blasting a huge hole in one wall. Air rushed by, and they could see down to the distant floor of the icy canyon. The trooper with the cannons was back. Steve dropped his shield as he dove out of the way. Bucky picked it up and advanced as the trooper recharged. He aimed at Bucky. Another burst came from the cannon and blasted Bucky out through the hole. He dropped the shield and caught onto one rung of a ladder on the outside of the car. The valley walls rushed by as the train continued to speed on. Struggling to his feet, Captain America held up his shield and started to advance on the giant trooper. Once again, the Hydra agent held up one of his cannon arms. The weapon hummed as the blue energy filled it and the trooper leveled it out, aiming right for the star on Steve's chest. The blue energy burst out of the cannon in a steady stream. But Cap lifted his shield just in the nick of time, and the energy hit it instead of him. With determined steps, Captain America pushed against the stream of energy, getting closer and closer to the trooper. Then, with one last mighty shove, he pushed the shield out in front of him, sending all the blue energy right back at the Hydra agent, blasting him through into the other car. This time, he was down for good. There was no time to celebrate. Steve clambered out through the hole. "Bucky!" he screamed over the roaring wind. "Hang on!" But the ladder was giving way, and Steve was too far to reach. Steve tried to get closer. "Grab my hand!" he shouted, and reached. And the rung broke free. "No!" Steve cried out, lunging for his friend. But he couldn't save him. Bucky fell, disappearing into the wind-swept depths of the canyon. Steve clung to the outside of the car, watching, unable to believe what he'd seen. Bucky, his oldest friend, the one he'd always looked up to. He was gone. Steve pulled himself back inside the car. The rest of the Howling Commandos had finished their sweep, and Jones was there, prodding Arnim Zola in front of him with the barrel of his gun. They had captured Hydra's main scientific mind, and Hydra's plan to trap and destroy Captain America and his Howling Commandos had failed. The mission was a success, but with Bucky gone, it didn't feel that way.